Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's free webinar, Building a Startup Growth Engine, How to Drive Sustainable Growth, Improve Your Sales Funnel, and Successfully Scale, with Chris Bechtel from Blue Deer and Gadiel Morantes from Early Growth Financial Services. My name is Erica Malsberg, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Early Growth Financial Services, and I'll be your moderator today. So this presentation is going to run about 40 minutes or so. If you have any questions as we go along, please just jump right in with them. You don't need to raise your hand. Just enter them into the question field, and we will address them as we can as we go along, or we'll wait till the end of the presentation to the Q&A at the end to address them. Also, if we run out of time, we'll follow up via Twitter, and you can also tweet any follow-up questions to @EarlyGrowthFS with the hashtag Growth Engine, and we'll follow up to those as well. You'll also be receiving an email tomorrow with a link to the slide deck as well as a recording of this presentation, so you'll be able to access all the information that way. So this morning, I'm very pleased to introduce our presenters to you. First, we're very pleased to have with us today Chris Bechtel. So Chris is a Principal, CMO, and Growth Hacker for Blue Deer. He has 20 years of marketing expertise, specializing in top of the funnel, including demand generation, marketing automation, pipeline optimization, content marketing, and sales 2.0 technologies. Chris has extensive experience working with startups and growth stage organizations to maximize the results of their digital marketing, PR, and revenue generation activities through the use of content and technology. He's worked with dozens of leading organizations, including Xerox, AnyMeeting.com, CarMax, City National Bank, eByline, Equities.com, iPressroom.com, the Los Angeles Opera, Target Corporation, Trend Micro, and Yahoo, among many others. So good afternoon and welcome to you, Chris.
Thanks, Erica. Happy to be here.
Great. And we also have with us today Gadiel Morantes. In addition to being a partner with Early Growth Financial Services, Gadiel is an accomplished executive with more than 15 years of sales, marketing, and operating experience. His vast experience both as an entrepreneur and working with entrepreneurs has given him great insight into what it takes to forge strong partnerships and build successful companies. Gadiel is also an advisor and mentor for Startups, a startup accelerator, and he's an active member of the Founders Network. So welcome and good afternoon to you, Gadiel.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Sure. So let's start, Chris, if you don't mind, if you could just tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and Blue Deer before we jump in here.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, and thanks again, everybody, for joining. I have a pretty diverse background. I started out, my first company was a rap video production company. I've always been very entrepreneurial. I went into the fashion industry, entertainment, and, during the early .com days, transitioned to internet consulting. I growth hacked and bootstrapped my own startup, which was a content management SaaS platform targeting the public relations industry. And since then, I have an exit about 2 years ago. I've been consulting with a number of startups, and mostly in B2B, but also B2B, SaaS, enterprise software, and mobile. And my goal is to really help everybody drive growth. And we'll talk about how I do that and what I've learned from all of this. I also speak regularly, General Assembly, and also for UCLA and Loyola, lecturing to graduate students as well as undergrad on digital PR and marketing.
Great. Thanks, Chris. It was kind of a tease. I thought you were going to wrap the rest of that intro, but maybe next time. And then, Gadiel, can you take just a few moments to tell a little bit about Early Growth Financial Services?
Absolutely, and I was actually gonna put Chris on the spot as well about the rapping. That's a nice little tidbit, Chris. I
can produce the rap. I can't rap. I can.
You know what? That's half the challenge, buddy. So thank you, Erica, and Chris. We're very thrilled to have you present about growth hacking and startup growth engine. It's a topic that's near and dear to the heart of many of our clients. At Early Growth Financial Services, we work with companies of all shapes and sizes, but a big part of our business is technology-based companies, anywhere from newly formed startups needing tax work, tax preparation help, up through companies needing 409A valuation services, day-to-day transactional accounting on an outsourced basis, and even CFO consulting services. So you can see a sampling of some of our clients here. These are some of the larger names, but we really help companies coming in right out of an incubator accelerator up through being mature, generating revenue, and starting to grow that way. And one of the challenges and questions we get often is how do I get my business at that next level? And I think that's why we felt that this topic and bringing Chris in to speak to this group was going to be immensely valuable to not only startups but frankly some established companies as they continue to gain traction or want to gain traction moving forward. So with that, just think of us as your accounting provider and accounting support. And then moving forward to the agenda, what will Chris be talking about today? What we'll start with kind of the common growth challenges that companies can face as they're starting themselves up and even starting to grow. What exactly is a growth engine, and how do I build and incorporate that in my own business? As I'm building this engine, there's going to be preferred channels and initiatives and prioritizing this as we move forward. So we'll be addressing that as well, and I'll be throwing in some of the thoughts that we have on the finance side and some of the experiences that we feel that some of our clients are going through. Fine-tuning your engine when you get to that stage is very important, and then kind of wrapping it up with finding the hidden gold, which is something that we're all in search for. And I know all companies, including early growth financial services, is always in the hunt for that success and that growth. And it's a huge, important stepping stone for us. And then once you get to that point, it's stepping on the gas, hitting on all cylinders and just trying to move the company forward, gain traction, gain users, and all that. So Chris will do a deep dive on each of these points, and I'll pepper in as we go along. But again, excited to have you, Chris, and why don't we kick it off?
Thanks so much, Gadio. Awesome. So, and I'm sure as everybody on the call, again, feel free to, type in some questions, so we can, I want to speak as specific to, some of your interests and needs and, maybe some of the industries that you're in. But, what we found, working with dozens of different, founders and CEOs and organizations, that, there's some common growth issues that we see across the spectrum. And a lot of times it's, everybody's in sort of a head down, in build mode. Oftentimes there's sort of an unfocused, sort of an ad hoc approach to things. These happen for a lot of reasons, but, hey, we need a marketing campaign, let's send out an email, right? Oftentimes maybe you don't have the core skill sets. There's not enough bandwidth. Maybe you're under-resourced in budget and time. Your team is junior and untrained. You're scrapping. You're doing what you can. Maybe you're not really ready to hire a senior team because you're just starting to scale. Maybe, in some cases, you've been around a little bit longer and your sales cycles are a little bit longer than you imagined. Your margins are a little thin. You've got some shrinking sales. Maybe some forecasts have been missed. Maybe you've just been so busy there's not really a plan for growth. You're just kind of doing what you think you need to be doing, but, there's not really a plan or a process or the tools. And that's really kind of what we're looking to talk about today. So kind of moving on, and then I guess, really what is a growth engine? So to me, this is actually taken from Deloitte, a large consulting firm, but in a paper they did a few years ago about developing a growth engine. And what I see that to really be, and what I've taken out of their insights, is that it's a systematic process that requires an organizational infrastructure to consistently find the value and execute on new business. So growth engine is not just sort of a short-term one-off, like let's just do this one thing. And I think, that's maybe the difference in sort of growth hacking, and we'll talk about that in a second. What's the difference between a growth engine and a growth hacker? But I think a growth engine is not just a one-off. It's a comprehensive approach to building, discipline and the sustainable capabilities to continuously grow over time. So kind of moving to the next slide, we've heard a lot about this word growth hacker. And those of us that have been doing marketing for many years, and there's kind of sometimes I'll get into some Twitter debates with people about marketing versus growth hacking and viral marketing and other things. But, Sean Ellis, who founded Qualaroo and who has a fantastic site called growthhacker.com, sort of coined the phrase that really a growth hacker is a professional who uses elements of marketing and market research along with the technology and some technical strategies to provide real marketing solutions. And I think, again, the goal is a growth hacker is going to derive a scalable, repeatable ways to grow the business. But I think the difference between sort of hacking growth and a growth engine is that it's a continuous process. So, it's a continuous process of finding ways in which you're going to grow and testing those strategies. So I believe a growth hacker needs a framework, and all good growth hackers really do have a framework. And so I think what this requires is sort of a shift in thinking. Like in many cases, and we've seen this as marketing has evolved from much of sort of an outbound approach. In many of the days before the internet, a lot of sales and marketing was done, in a very outbound sort of interruption marketing. I'm going to send you a letter, I'm going to call you, I'm going to bother you, right, rather than an inbound approach. And so what that meant a lot of times is that organizations were kind of very siloed. You have sort of customers and customer service, sales, executives, marketing, and everybody's very, company and product specific, where I think in the sort of the new alignment is that all of these systems and departments are aligned so that there's a unified strategy that's very customer-centric, that ultimately is going to develop, long-term relationships. It's much more authentic rather than being scripted. So we're really looking and demonstrating to the customer that we're really creating value, and that we're going to create value in the organization because we have customers that we're engaged with that we didn't necessarily pay to acquire, that came in because we hard sold them. We came in because we offered them something of real value.
Chris, I think that that's an important point, not to just jump in, but I look at my experience in starting out my career, 18 years ago, 17 years ago now, and the sales function and the customer service function were very different and not aligned. They had their own purposes as they were growing the company, but the communication just wasn't there. And when we look at startups and we look at companies that are emerging and really starting to grow, that collaboration is hugely important, and making sure that everyone within the organization has the one focus and the one goal in place, and that's to grow the company, to provide excellent service, to provide an excellent product, whatever that is, whatever their goals are. So I couldn't stress on that more, and from my experience, I think more companies are really starting to focus on that area moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Scotty. I totally, and ultimately, I think you probably, again, seen this being on the sales side, that sales and marketing often, are not working in an integrated, alignment, right? Where, in many cases, sales and marketing are kind of in these two different worlds and not working together is what you've seen, right? And the more in which it's a unified strategy that's centered around the customer's needs, the more effective you're going to be in the end, right?
Absolutely.
So moving forward, again, all of this growth engine methodology is kind of built on, for those of you that are familiar with, Eric Ries and Steve Blank and the Lean Startup, and I'd encourage everyone to, check that out. But essentially, what it's teaching is that in the early days of a startup, it's really about the search for a customer, and you're doing customer discovery and customer validation and pivoting, if necessary, to ultimately find the customer and a validated business model. Well, now in the growth engine phase, we're really talking about execution and scaling, right? Where we move from, customer validation really into company building. So we've discovered our customer, and now we need to find ways to acquire them in the most efficient way possible. And that's really what we're kind of talking about today.
And the typical demographic of those companies, as we see them, is you've got the very early stage companies that are working through the product. Maybe they're a part of an incubator, an accelerator, raise some friends and family money, and they're coming out of that having fine-tuned exactly what they're looking to do and the client base they're going to go after. And so we do see a lot of our clients really focus in on, and frankly we do as a firm ourselves at Early Growth, on that lean startup model. You can really build a pretty successful company with that philosophy, especially in this day and age with the resources and the availability of outsourced providers and folks like that to help grow the company.
Absolutely. You know, and I think so then sort of in this model, what I want to walk you all through today is to give you some insight and maybe, you know, some potential ways of thinking about how to scale your business in very practical ways. And so the key is, again, all of you I'm sure have goals, you know, both short and long term, and are focused on, you know, what are you trying to accomplish, you know, in both the short and the long term. You know, you're either looking to acquire, you know, users or customers or downloads, subscriptions, contracts, and revenue. You know, certainly some of you may, you know, revenue may not be your immediate goal, and I'm sure Gadiel would agree, though, that revenue obviously is something that investors, you know, will certainly look for. Obviously, they want to see growth in one area or another, significant growth, but obviously having revenue is going to be another significant component of helping you get to the next level, get more capital, and be able to, you know, use that revenue to continue to grow. But I think
Absolutely.
the key is, right, you know, and the key is, and so yeah, Gadiel, what would you say in terms of like, you know, what you guys are putting together in terms of, you know, performas and those types of things, and wouldn't you agree that these are the kinds of metrics that, you know, investors want to see?
Absolutely. That's a huge piece of it. You know, we talk a lot about when we're working with companies and other presentations that we do is milestone financing and having these milestones that you've carved out that you're going to prove to your investors. So as an investor is looking at a company and deciding how much money they're going to invest, or frankly if they're going to invest at all, the milestone financing and achieving those numbers and those metrics are very, very important. So back to your point about revenue, I mean, we work with quite a few companies that are pre-revenue companies, and depending on what space they're in and what their product is, I mean, it can be years before they actually start generating that, but you're always tying it back to, you know, user experience, user count. You know, you talk about users and customers and downloads and subscriptions. All of that is huge when it comes to those milestones, and the revenue is just one component of that. So you're exactly right, Chris. I mean, it is a huge function of that, and investors focus on that greatly before they actually write those checks.
And so, you know, I think so building on that then and moving on to the next slide, right, it's really about, you know, being focused on what your goals are and who you're specifically trying to reach is going to drive this whole process. So then obviously a lot of this is still about business models, some of these questions, but it's just further focus on the customer. So maybe in the early stages of validating your business model, you've been doing that, but now what we're really looking to do is kind of fill out, and we'll get to that in the next slide, is really the buyer persona, right, and really understanding the psychology, you know, of those users, of the subscribers, of the downloads. You know, what need are you solving? What pain are you dealing with? You know, who your target customers see now is filling the needs. So this helps a little bit on positioning. How are you different? And this is also, I think, a key component of the growth engine here is what channels do your target customers prefer to find services such as yours? And among each of those targets in the previous slide, users, you may have different types of users, be it based on geography, based on behavior, based on what their need is, and all of those different user types may have different channels that they prefer and that they tend to use and that are more influential. Same thing with the influencers. You know, typically when we use the word influencers, we're talking about people, right? We're talking about people that are influential, whether they're thought leaders, whether they're industry leaders, whether they're your peers. And the more understanding we can get about what influences the buying decision, it's critical. There's a little quote here from Steve Blank, who is one of the proponents of the lean startup. Again, he's got some great stuff online. I would encourage everybody to check him out, Google what he's talking about. But this he sort of takes from these early days of customer validation. You know, he has these words about outside the building. Facts exist outside the building. Opinions reside within. So oftentimes, you know, we'll be working when we sit in the boardroom and we talk about, okay, you know, and the customer is interested in this and the customer is interested in that. But the reality is, you know, and we may even have an assumption that, you know, the majority of our customers are, you know, we're going to find them through Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or Google or another channel. But we don't really know. And so this quote is basically like opinions reside within the building. So get the hell outside the building, which means you got to get out there and actually test it, right? So just like when we're searching for a customer, we do customer interviews and we actually talk to people and we put things up, minimum viable product type things to validate that there's real interest. We need to do the same thing with our channels.
So when you do that, Chris, with a client that you're working with and kind of peeling back the onion of what is their product and who are their customers, are there a lot of the folks you're working with, they have an existing client base and you start there, or how does that work exactly as you're kind of doing this fact-finding mission, which is what it sounds like here?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, everybody is already, has their product or their service, their business is in some stage, and they do have customers that they're marketing to and engaged users, but they may not have a super clear, usually the challenge is that they don't have a super clear vision of where they're acquiring the customers from, what channel is the most effective, right? Like I said, so people end up going, well, we should be on Google, we should send some email, we should do some PR, they just kind of do what most people are doing, but they don't necessarily have a super clear view of which of those channels, are either A, have the most effective cost, like from a customer acquisition cost standpoint, as well as which of those customers end up converting or are super quality. Depending again on everybody's funnel. Some, maybe it's an immediate purchase. Others, you got to get them into your funnel and nurture them over 2, 3, 4 months. But if you get a whole bunch of the wrong people into your funnel, and then none of them convert, so those are usually the issues that I see, right?
Great.
So I think moving on to the next slide, and I think this is why it starts with sort of the buyer persona. And you could get super scientific with it. You could do a lot of primary research, but oftentimes, it's a collective and an ongoing process, right? Where you, put yourself in the shoes of each of these customers, and I think just sort of starting to think about the different profiles, because you may think, okay, well, we have one product or one core product or service, and think about this in terms of one buyer, but that may not actually be the case. You may have buyers, again, based on geography, urban versus suburban, age, but also use case is another one. So the more that you can kind of start to think about who the different buyers, users, subscribers may be of the product or service, the more it's going to give you some insights into their psychology, right? And I think moving to the next slide gives us some sort of examples. Sort of some attributes and insights, sort of what are the challenges, of course, but also like the personality of these buyers. Are they competitive, humanistic, methodical, or spontaneous? There are some purchases that are very methodical. Enterprise software, for example, because of the nature of it, it's a large business, tends to be a very methodical purchase. Some other very larger financial transactions, so a lot of trust needs to be built. There's a lot of knowledge and learning that needs to happen. Others, certainly more consumer-based products and services, and maybe more of a spontaneous purchase, right? And so then, that also is going to help us give us insight into the preferences for information types. On the spontaneous side, I've seen, obviously, the kind of preferences is social proof, right? Others that are like me are buying, right? Whereas, like in the enterprise, similarly, I want to see that other big companies like my big company bought the product or service, but I also have a lot of needs for education, and I need tools that's going to help me educate my boss or my counterparts, right? So this is the idea. The more that you can kind of document this sort of buyer journey, the more effective I think you're going to be in sort of selecting and optimizing the channels that you're going to select and the content that you're going to use in those channels to acquire your customers.
And it also ties in very directly to the actual cost of acquisition of that customer, right? And that's an important function on the finance side, and frankly, as the company grows, it needs to know what each of these customers cost to go out and acquire them, and are they actually targeting the right folks? And I think that ties it all in really nicely with the previous slides that you've spoken to, Chris. That's a huge part of it from at least our perspective.
Absolutely, I totally agree, Gadiel. And it's funny, like, oftentimes people would think that, well, finance, accounting, and marketing are complete opposite ends of the spectrum, where one is like creative, entrepreneurial, let's try this, and, finance and accounting is, like restrictive numbers, very linear, but the two are more and more married together. Exactly what you just said, Gadiel. I mean, it's all about understanding what's the lifetime value of a customer, right? How valuable are they to me, the LTV, and what's the customer acquisition cost by channel, so that we can be super smart, right? Because that's ultimately what this growth engine is all about. It's about finding the ideal channel that has the lowest customer acquisition cost that we can really ramp up, right? And so numbers and the ability to analyze those costs are incredibly important, and knowing then, be able to then put into, a pro forma or financial projection on, okay, we know what our current customer acquisition cost is, and we know what the channels are, and if we just had X dollars more in capital, well, we can grow at this rate, right?
Before we move on, we have a question here from the audience. Annie was saying that she's heard that you should be able to distill down to just one buyer persona. Is there any value in that, to drilling it down into one?
Well, I think it's a good question. To me, I look at it in terms of priority. So I think that I would agree that drilling down into one buyer persona in terms of priority, like it's really about prioritizing down into one. I mean, certainly, it's difficult to market to many different buyer personas, so I think that you may have 3 or 4 or 5, but I think it's ultimately, yeah, it is about finding that ideal buyer for you, right? And I think that's probably what her question is of all of the potential buyers that we have, which is the ideal buyer that brings us the highest lifetime customer value, that's the most engaged, that is the easiest to acquire, that brings in the most capital and revenue, right? So I would say that I would just flip the word to prioritized buyer, right? And then maybe we are continuously looking for other buyer personas to add to it.
Great, thank you.
So now we kind of move into this sort of acquisition channels. And this is, again, taken from Eric Ries, the author of The Lean Startup. And he kind of talks about 4 ways that customers, so again, you sort of see the thinking that it's very customer-centric. So it's about how do customers drive sustainable growth. And I think that's sort of the real flip in thinking. Rather than the company driving sustainable growth, it's the customer, right? And I think we all know it intuitively. That, word of mouth, we trust our peers, right? We're much more likely to trust our friends or colleagues or somebody we know that had an experience with a product or service than we are, a banner ad, right? Secondly, the product, right? The product itself, we've seen a number of examples of products that are, you would call sticky, or the product itself, by in the way in which it works, encourages customers to share the product and engage with others. Paid advertising, certainly, again, I would say that's, it's a way to get customers quickly, but I think in the long term, paid is just a supporting channel, in my view. And repeat use, right? Depending on how the product works, again, is how do we get customers, so instead of just, once a year or one time, how can we get customers to use the product repeatedly? So I think, Eric has a little quote over here, by the time the product is ready to be distributed widely, it will already have some established customers. And I think the point is that, it's like, how can you look to however many customers you have now, maybe you're even a pre-launch and you've just got beta, and you've got 50 or 100 or 500, how can you use that initial base to grow from there, right? How can you use that initial base of customers to spread the word? So let's see. So moving on, I then kind of think about, and some of you may have looked, seen this, but I tend to look at your acquisition channels in these kind of buckets, paid, owned, and earned media, because in sort of today, before the internet really, there were only a handful of channels that we could use to reach our target audiences, and we typically had to go through the media. We had, radio, television, maybe some billboards, some newspapers. I mean, there were like 10 channels. Now we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of channels. And in many organizations, whether you're, a super small startup with 5 people to, Target Corporation, you're a media company in many cases, right? And so that's what your owned media is. So your owned media is really your website, your blog, your social media channels, the media that you own. Earned media, I would categorize as, press coverage, bloggers that have written about you, reviews, social media, conversations, referrals, that type of thing, and paid. There's certainly PPC, display, sponsorships, other types of paid media. And I would really look to, ideally, it's about using an integrated mix of all 3. Ideally, over the long term, I think, owned and earned tend to get the highest concentration of quality customers over paid. Paid is, good ways to juice and, get a larger volumes of paid if you need to scale quickly, but they tend to, the quality of leads come from paid tend not to be as high unless you're going for very niche, targeted paid distribution. But ideally, again, it's sort of an overlay. That's why this Venn diagram, right? And you want to acquire and nurture them, and ultimately in the center, we're going to get, a real quality customer. So, but again, I think, yeah, go ahead, Gadio, please.
Just to jump in really quickly, and when you're a very early stage young startup, I think the owned and earned media outlets or channels are things that companies can very much influence and work on, and it's much more cost effective, to your point. And what we see is a lot of the companies go out, and when they raise that money, that's when they turn on kind of the paid media spigot, if you will, and that's kind of when the paying for advertising and things like that is kind of turned on. At least in our experience, is that what you're seeing as well?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and and to your point, Gadio, like a lot of early stage, it's like you don't even have the resources to fully do across all channels and either owned or earned. So again, knowing who the buyer is, right? You kind of tend to focus on 1 or 2 or 3, right? So just within owned media, you may just be able to focus on your blog and effectively using Twitter, for example, right?
And from your experience, Chris, how measuring the success of each of these different channels, when you're actually putting dollars and cents to the paid piece of it, whereas owned and earned, there's a lot of sweat equity in those. And if you have somebody managing those channels internally, obviously there's the salary on that. But how do you go about measuring the actual success in each of those challenges? Is it just going to be direct bottom line users, or how does that work?
Well, good question for sure. Goals, right? And this is definitely one of the tricky components of it, and that a lot of organizations tend to struggle with a little bit. And it is about sort of putting a smart foundation in place. Again, what are the goals that we're going after? Is it downloads, subscriptions, purchases? So what does our funnel look like? And we'll get to that in a minute. And then, really trying to put the proper, technology in place to track where our customers are coming from. That is really critical in getting sort of an understanding of the effectiveness of each of these channels. Now, certainly to some degree, there are some branding exercises, but if you're really trying to scale, you don't have the time you're not really branding, a branding goal is probably secondary. You're looking for actual, you need traction, right? So I think it's really about really trying to ensure that you have Google Analytics and the right tools to actually track where the customers are coming from, right? And getting somebody to set that up for you so that at least you may not be able to know down to the, tweet level, the specific tweet, though that, may be possible. It is possible. But even just to know that we tend to get signups from Twitter versus LinkedIn, right? So laying that groundwork, I think, is critical.
So we have a couple of questions here. First, Justin wants to know if you have any tips or strategies for getting earned media. How do you get that sort of press coverage or social media referrals or the other earned media types?
Yeah, good question. I mean, certainly we could do, we could have a whole hour on, which maybe we should do, Erica, on sort of earned media and PR, right? But I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's interesting because it kind of boils down what media relations really is to get earned media coverage, which is about figuring out what the trend is, what are people talking about, like in terms of traditional, more mainstream media, right? They want to obviously, they have their own goals in terms of traffic. They have a very clear editorial set of guidelines. So if it's about mainstream media coverage or even the tech press, TechCrunch or VentureBeat or any of those, it's really about looking at what are the trends that they're writing about. What have they determined is of interest to their readers, and then trying to add sort of value on top of that. So there's certain types of things that will get coverage. Certainly funding news, any significant differences, but also, certain things that maybe are, that go against the grain. They like things that are maybe non-traditional. Think about that. Think about numbers. Media like numbers. So as much as you can come up with numbers, even if you're obviously a startup and you're privately held, you're not going to release your financial, but maybe there's certain numbers about trends. Maybe you have unique insight that your platform or service has gotten that you can offer that's a trend that you can then display. That's one thing. So I would look for numbers as much as possible and try and provide content that provides a unique point of view on a topic. You may also look for something that they've already written and you have something new to add to that conversation, or something new that either goes against the grain of what they've written about before, something that's unexpected. Those are some of the what I would tend to do. So really think about it. It's really, I think that the key to earned media is not to do a mass approach, because then, you don't want to be a spam. You don't want to spam journalists, or you don't want to spam bloggers. My recommendation would be to kind of look at, again, back to the buyer persona, which publications, and again, even in early stage, some of your audiences may be actual, angel investors or venture capital, right? They're not your customers, but they are stakeholders that you do want to reach with your story. But in the meantime, if you're just looking for traction among your customers, what publications do they tend to read, right? And really just target maybe 5 to 20, and really research those publications and the journalists that are currently writing for them and the bloggers that are writing. What are they writing? And what are they writing about, and how can you prepare something that provides some unique insight? I think the other final piece on that is like your story. I think, media, they really like stories. It's about trying to package up a story that's unique and interesting. How can you take your story about your company, and maybe it's about your founders, right? People like to write about people. And so maybe, the founders have a unique story that brings that kind of is an interesting story to tell.
Great, thanks. And then we have another question here from Ose, and I'm not sure I'm understanding it exactly, but I think it's an interesting question, so I'll kind of put it out there. You and Gadiel spoke briefly to the interplay between, finance and accounting and marketing. And I think what he's asking here is what role can a CFO within an organization play to help support growth and marketing activities? Like, how does that interplay sort of play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great.
I think from go ahead. Well, I was just going to mention, Chris, I think, as we're talking about the stage of company, obviously the CFO plays a very important role in what's going on the marketing side and the marketing aspect, whether it's providing an actual budget for the marketing spend and the marketing efforts, and then figuring out as we're going out and trying to acquire these new clients and customers, how much is that going to cost us moving forward? How much is each new customer going to cost us, and kind of breaking that out. And then figuring out and partnering on the early stage companies, the goal in mind is to have traction, have revenue, and have growth. And from that perspective, I feel as though it is very much a hand-in-hand, hey, this is what we're doing, we're going to go out and pay for some media, tying in the marketing folks and figuring out, okay, on the marketing side of the house, what is that spend going to be to make sure that we're achieving those numbers and that growth? And by all means, Chris, jump in.
Yeah, I totally agree. Add to that, I think, I mean, I've seen it in numerous companies. I mean, I think it's also starting with a budget, right? What is the available budget currently for marketing? Because that tends to be like a common thing. You know, a startup will bring in a marketer or even an agency, and they'll say, well, you know, they'll say to the marketer, okay, well, give me a budget, and the marketer will be like, well, how much money do you have to spend? You know. So it's like I think it's kind of like, so a CFO, you know, in terms of where the current company stands currently in terms of its financial picture, what money is available for growth activities, right? So then you can empower the marketer to kind of go and say, okay, I'm going to use this money as efficiently as possible, right? And then once you are using that money as efficiently, then, you know, setting up the general ledger so that you have, you know, the right ability to, you know, to identify the costs. And where are those costs going to, right? Which channels? So I think that's how the CFO, and also then looking at, so it's sort of accounting for what's currently happening and then also looking forward in terms of if we spend this money on these channels and these are our current growth rates, you know, this is the growth we're going to be able to achieve if we get another 1.5 million, right? So hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thanks. I think that's super
moving
helpful.
Forward. Yeah, so moving ahead, because we've got, you know, what makes the most use of our time. And so then this kind of is a slide about acquisition and channels, and we've been kind of talking about it. But, you know, just sort of just for thinking, to get everyone on the call to kind of think about all of the potential acquisition channels there are and kind of group them, you know, sort of with your company in the middle. And certainly at the top, you know, we've got partners and business development. You know, is a critical role, you know, which Gadiel, I'm sure you could talk to. You know, how much are you seeing in terms of, you know, business development playing a role in growth?
Well, I think it's a huge component, and not only in the direct selling aspect of talking and engaging with clients and customers, but also in partnering hand in hand with the marketing efforts and where we're focusing our time on the acquisition channels. I know, for instance, Erica and I and the group at Early Growth, we work very, very closely together as we're analyzing where are we getting our referrals or incoming leads, or, you know, where's time best spent from our perspective as well as from hers and her teams. And so it is very much a hand-in-hand process.
Yeah, and I would say, and that's kind of why a channel that, again, I think it goes back to your buyer and the buyer persona, right? And it's really about a ranking, and I think we'll see as we have another slide here about sort of ranking the channels, because again, you know, all of you on the call, I'm sure, you know, it's about trying to figure out what's the right mix. So again, this is sort of the review of these acquisition channels. We want to surround our target customers, which is with as many of the right channels as possible, right? Just one channel is not going to work. Oftentimes, I see this a lot. You know, oh, we need to grow. Let's hire a sales guy or two, right? Or let's hire somebody with a Rolodex and they'll get us business, right? Well, you know, the salesperson gets in there and they're like, okay, well, I need leads, you know, or nobody's heard about us, right? You know, so you need more than one channel. So it's really about finding the right channel, and that's kind of what this diagram is saying. You know, what's the right mix? And ultimately, you get the right mix across all these channels, you're going to get growth.
Yeah, and it's very much, it's not an all or nothing type of engagement, right? I mean, I think as you're growing the organization, the budget, the company, you're adding on these different channels as you go, right?
Exactly. And, you know, and certainly, exactly, and, you know, and the level of effort within each channel can grow, right? So I'm sure, you know, some of you may feel a little bit daunting, you know, there's a lot to be done just even in the bucket in PR and social media, or lead gen and email marketing. I mean, you could do a ton of it, but I think the idea here would be to just start, you know, in small ways and prioritize. And I think the next slide, if we can move on to that, is sort of the idea. Okay, so this is looking at analyzing your channels. So this is sort of in the stage here in the presentation is just kind of where are you now, right? Where are you getting growth from? So this is just a screenshot from Google Analytics that, if you're not using, I would recommend that you do use. But you can put goals into Google Analytics, so you can assess a goal value. You can set up multiple goal values. So if it's just a download or a sign up, you may have a value, which can help. Again, you can work with your CFO to really assess what the value you should place there is. But this can really help you to understand, how much are we spending and what's the goal value that we're getting from a channel. But, this is, again, just a piece of insight to help you understand where are we getting currently our traffic and our customers. Moving on, I want to try and get through this. So again, sort of the idea is to look for opportunities, right? As Eric Ries talks about, sort of the three engines of growth. This sort of sticky engine of growth. So this may be the product is sticky. It's something that we have to use frequently. There's a viral component of it, and we've all, I'm sure, have examples that we're dealing with and we've seen, and the paid engine of growth. But these are all ways in which you want to maybe be thinking about what are the opportunities for you to tune your engine. I'm going to move on kind of quickly here. This is kind of also, I talked about the funnel. For those of you that haven't kind of thought about your funnel, but it is, it's the shape of a funnel. It's wide at the top and narrow at the bottom, right? And, you may want to look at your current funnel. What's the issue now? Are you not getting enough prospects entering the top of the funnel? So, hey, right now your conversion rates to somebody's visiting you and they sign up or whatever they do is pretty good. So maybe you're not getting enough of them. Or maybe the other issues, you're just not getting enough of the right people. I see this a lot actually with paid, Google PPC, where you might get a ton of traffic, but very little of it actually converts. And maybe that's just because of the nature of, your specific PPC ads, and that maybe that needs to be addressed. But it could also just be the channel itself. Maybe your acquisition costs are very high. Again, I see this a lot with PPC. It may cost you, $500 to $1,000. That may be way out of whack. And again, work with your CFO to understand what's your threshold. What can you spend to acquire a customer? Maybe you have some underutilized channels, right? Maybe LinkedIn you're just not using at all, and it could be a channel that you could use a lot more of. Slow velocity. In marketing, we talk a lot about the velocity through the funnel, and this is essentially from when somebody first enters the top of our funnel to when they convert, either to a paying customer, to an engaged user. But we want them to flow efficiently through the funnel. Are they stuck in a stage? Sometimes you'll see this a lot of times in longer sales cycle types of things, or sometimes in freemium models I'll see this, where we want to ultimately convert people to paid users, but they're stuck in a stage. So what are the issues currently? So I think that's just sort of a key component to understand the current buyer journey, right? So this is kind of just, we have two slides here on just sort of knowing your funnel, just sort of an e-commerce funnel where there's a purchase has sort of this pretty straightforward where you get impressions, you get clicks, you get some page views, maybe people register, and then they buy, right? And there's a conversion rate at each step in this funnel. So some of you, the opportunity for driving growth may actually be in trying to improve a conversion rate in one of these stages. I see typically an earlier stage, the issues more at the top of the funnel, but you may really there may be a real opportunity for revenue that's further down in the funnel. I also have seen where people have, they've acquired, 1,000 or 10,000 email addresses or 200,000 email addresses, but they're not really nurturing very well. They haven't touched those people recently or consistently to get a higher conversion rate out of the people that they've already touched, right? In many cases, it's a lot easier to get dollars out of people that we've already engaged with than trying to attract somebody brand new, right? Second funnel here on the next slide is more of a B2B software where the sales cycle is a little bit longer theoretically. So again, you've got impressions and visitors. Maybe they register to download something, like either request a demo or they get some piece of content. And now that lead then kind of moves into a sales function. There's some interaction with the sales team. But here's where, this stage could be, a month or it could be 6 months. And if we can move it from 6 months to 30 days, that could be some significant value creation for the business, right? Gadiel, what kind of, thoughts have you seen? I'm sure that you've seen this sort of issues that you see commonly in terms of, flow through the funnel.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway from the funnel piece is don't waste your time on stuff that's not going to produce an actual new customer. And we see that a lot, is really identifying who your target audience is, focusing in on that. There is a lot of noise out there. And so that's kind of the biggest challenge I think a lot of companies have. So to your point of making sure your funnel is full, but then also figuring out who those key buyers are, that part of it is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think to add to that on this slide now, which is sort of our, what I call good growth engine. So this is the acronym: goal-oriented and opportunity-driven. So we've got to be very clear on the goals. And again, the more you prepare in the beginning on who's the real customer, you're going to attract better quality people into the top of the funnel. You'll be able to produce content that's more relevant to them, that engages with them, that nurtures them and moves them faster through the funnel. Because if you can understand what buttons to push, I like this, if many of you have not heard this acronym of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So you can use those types of, there's other sales methodologies. There's a challenger sales methodology. But again, knowing who your customer is and knowing what kinds of buttons to push, challenging people's beliefs, getting them to feel, to worry, wait a minute, I better make a decision here and convert or my competitor will, right? Or that kind of thing.
And being able to identify and really speak to this slide specifically is a key component to companies that are looking to raise funds in the future. You have to really be able to talk to this piece within your organization.
Yes, exactly. And to be able to show investors that I know where the opportunities are, right? And we've worked it into a science. Ideally, this is a science that you're continually improving so that when you get that additional capital, you know which buttons to push and where you're going to put that capital to keep the growth. So the next slide is really about tuning this engine. So, it's really about testing new programs. So again, whether it's, okay, we feel that Twitter's an opportunity, or we've seen some opportunity with Twitter. Well, let's roll out a new program to further test and validate that. Use an integrated cross-channel approach, as I've mentioned. So, if maybe you're going to put out a piece of content, promote that piece of content across a few different channels. Try and create content that inspires. Again, I think, this is a little bit of a challenge. Everybody is a media company, and you've got to find ways to create content that's, and now we're starting to see it. I'm sure you're all seeing it, like almost this content marketing or content overload. And some of it's kind of crappy content. We're starting to see that. So we do have to, find ways to really, again, get into the heads of our buyers and create content that is inspiring, that is educational, that they can either learn or be entertained by, right? And as I mentioned previously, tuning your engine, if you optimize some of these conversion points, you can really see real results. And I think the other piece of this is, and what this is trying to do, is to execute efficiently and consistently and give you just a framework for continuous improvement. Because I think that's the big takeaway I've got. It's about prioritization. That, all of you, no matter what stage you're in, whether you've raised a Series B and, you've got 15 million in the bank, or you've just got, your first seed round and you got 500,000, right? You've got a set of limited resources and time. And you need to execute efficiently, and that, to me, is about prioritizing. So that means reviewing KPIs, and you can work with your CFO to establish, and get some of the data from the financial side of the house. What are the key performance indicators we want to look at in the business? And finally, this word Kaizen comes from sort of the Toyota lean manufacturing. Kaizen is continuous improvement, and that's what we're looking to do. So finally, I think this is really about staying focused on the customer, and that's really, truly, at the end of the day, we can get super scientific with SEO, and we can do all kinds of stuff with algorithms, and we can look at all the analytics, but ultimately the analytics are trying to give us insight into the customer, into the user, because what we want are delighted, engaged customers. So that really is an integration across marketing, product, sales, across the entire organization. And I think marketing and everything that it does can provide a lot of insight back into product and back into the business that's going to yield to really smart strategies.
I couldn't agree with you more there, Chris, and the fact that we do see and work with a lot of companies and help them focus on that piece of it, because we all fall in love with our own product and what we're building, and sometimes forget that what we're building is for a specific audience, and if we don't listen to or focus on that audience, then our company is not going to be successful. So I think that was great. And Erica, do we have any questions? I know we're pushing up on time, so just wanted to...
No, I think we're okay. I think that closing remarks would be useful, and then if there's follow-up questions, we can follow up through Twitter and through email after.
Fantastic, Chris. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, to kind of the last point I made. I think it's about being very clear and prioritizing, and this is what I find is the most common issue, is that, you're, especially as a CEO, as a senior executive in the company, you have to wear many, many hats, and your team also is wearing many, many hats in a startup. So I think the key is really about a prioritization at every step in the process. Prioritizing which customer segment we're going to go after, prioritizing which channel we're going to use, prioritizing, the content we're going to test, the assets we're going to use. So at every step, brainstorm every possible way you're going to hack growth, but then choose the top 1, 2, 3, test those, and move forward.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that, all these slides and what you've spoken to today is hugely valuable for, not only our client base, but many companies out there, whether they are your, tech startups or frankly established businesses. There's a lot of takeaways from this on how to grow your business, how to attack certain channels, how to deal with the client acquisition. So I want to thank you very much, Chris. I think it was a fantastic presentation, and I know hugely valuable to me as well as to the folks on this call and our client base as well. So thank you for that. And obviously our contact info is there. And then Erica, I'll leave you with any last follow-up thoughts.
Sure, yeah, we do have a few last questions, but as we're run out of time, we will just follow up. So if you've asked a question that wasn't addressed, be sure that we will respond to you on that. And yeah, I just want to second that, what Gadiel said. Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, again, I think this was really useful to the people on the call. It was really useful for me as well. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come and present to us all. Again, if you have follow-up questions in addition to any that are still awaiting being responded to, you can contact us via this contact information, or you can also tweet to us at Early Growth FS or at Chris Bechtel, and you can just use the hashtag Growth Engine, and we'll respond to that. Just so you know, also, we do have another free webinar coming up this Friday, August 22nd, with Fenwick & West and Early Growth Financial Services on seed funding your startup from bootstrapping to convertible debt and Series seed financing. So if that sounds useful to you, we hope that you will join us for that one as well. If not, you can check out our events page for other upcoming webinars, and we hope to connect with you again soon. So thanks again, Chris and Gadiel. Really useful. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everyone for attending. Have a great day.